Well, we ended reading from the original of the Belgic Confession in Article 36. And we saw that Article 36 had this rather definite kind of view of the office of the civil magistrate with respect to the gospel, with respect to the church. And work begins on this to change this because the church comes to conviction that this language, which they referred to, this is in the 19th century now, we're talking in the 1870s and 80s in the Netherlands, and they're talking about this, they call what I just read, I think properly, Constantinian language, coming from the time of Constantine. And here's ultimately what Dr. Kuyper had to say about that. His years were 1837 to 1920, I should just say, but I think Wendy will say a few more things about that. I should say that what Wendy is doing is just recorded and will be added in. It will not be delivered from here, so hopefully you understand that. Kuyper said this in the 1890s. We oppose this Constantinian language in Article 36 out of complete conviction, prepared to bear the consequences of our conviction, even when we'll be denounced and mocked on that account as unreformed. We would rather be considered not reformed and insist that men ought not to kill heretics than that we are left with a reformed name as the prize for assisting in the shedding of the blood of heretics. It is our conviction, and part of the reason I'm doing this is everybody thinks all this stuff just happened in America. This isn't America we're talking about. We're talking about the Netherlands in the 1880s and 90s. Dr. Kuyper, he says, it is our conviction that the examples which are found in the Old Testament are of no force for us because the infallible indication of what was or was not heretical, and he means to the priesthood and to the kingship, which was present at that time, is now lacking. We don't have a direct word. Like Peter had. I mean, Ananias and Sapphira. I mean, wouldn't that make church discipline easy? Like, no, you're lying. Boom, you're down. Take her, take him out, take her out. I mean, no, we can't do that. Doesn't work that way. That the Lord, he says further, it is our conviction that the Lord and the apostles never called upon the help of the magistrate to kill with the sword the one who deviated from the truth, even in connection with such horrible heretics as defiled the congregation in Corinth. Paul mentions nothing of this idea. And it cannot be concluded from any particular word of the New Testament that in the days when particular revelation should cease, that the rooting out of heretics with a sword is the obligation of magistrates. And he reflects here on Romans 13, 1-7 and says, nothing is said here. And also, we're going to be reading in 1 Peter in a little bit. He talks about magistrates. Nothing is said there either of that sort. He says that our fathers have not developed this, it's our conviction that our fathers have not developed this monstrous proposition out of principle, but have taken it over from Romish practice. And I think he's absolutely right about that. It's taken over from the Reformation was really focusing on soteriology and ecclesiology. It was focusing on the theology. This politics was just taken over from what was going on before. It did not get, I believe, it did not get, there will be those who differ, but I don't think it got the proper scrutiny and the proper biblical scrutiny. And if you look at this whole subject, and we're going to talk a little bit about covenanting and our covenanter friends and where they take this, it's pretty thin gruel what they're looking at. And they look at certain Old Testament passages and say, this applies now. What applied to the kings of Israel applies now to the civil magistrates everywhere. And basically, what applied to Israel as a theocracy, Israel was a holy nation. They were a holy nation. That's how they were constituted. You say, well, wait a minute, they had a lot of problems. Right, they did. But they were God's covenant people. And there were those among them who truly knew Him, and there were those who didn't. We know that. They were a mixed multitude, always at best. Sometimes a pretty low number in the good. But this is Israel of old. And this is the church of old. This is the church under age. So in the New Testament, Israel is the church of God. And we're going to read in 1 Peter 2. Peter now, of all people, who, he wasn't exactly he had his own Gentile issues, right? He wasn't Paul was the apostle of the Gentiles, not Peter. He was always a reluctant teacher of them in a sense. But what does he call the church? A holy nation. So let me just stop here and say, maybe you're saying, well, what do you think about a Christian nation? The Bible speaks about it. It's the church. I'll have more to say about that. But that's the holy nation, the church. Peter says it. The Pope, no, he wasn't the Pope. But I had to see if you're awake out there. Back to Kuyper. He says, it's our conviction that the acceptance and carrying out of this principle almost always has returned upon the heads of non-heretics. If you know history, it has. And not the truth, but heresy has been honored by the magistrate. Do you know what happened in the Netherlands between the Synod of Dort in 16, 18, 19 and the next 200 years to 1816? You had all these faithful men in the church wanting to call a synod to deal with these errors. Arminianism, you thought, well, they put Arminianism down. Well, it wasn't dead, folks. But many other things. Cartesianism, what's that? Well, we're not going to talk about it now, but I'll just throw it out there. There was a lot of stuff the church wanted to deal with, and they wanted to have a synod to deal with it. They couldn't meet for 200 years in a synod to deal with all these things. Why? What were they? The state, which was over the church, said they couldn't. You say, oh, well, weren't they Protestants? Yes, that's called Erastianism. The state over the church, telling the church what to do. They couldn't meet. And you say, well these people, they needed Christian magistrates. They were all Christian. Now, some of them probably really were Christian, and others of them probably weren't Christian. But they were all Christian in name. You would be astounded if people like that were standing for election today. They would have been pretty sound in terms of what you would understand the faith to be. And so you're like, well, if we could only get those kind of people in, here's the thing. Somebody said to me the other day, I wish we had like Europe. I wish we had the pillarization. That's another thing. You could maybe, Wendy will talk about that. But what happened in the Netherlands, and you have all the different groups have their whole sort of lives. And you have Christian political parties. And I said, so that would make it easy. You would know exactly who to vote for and what. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, well, I might not vote for that party. And he's like, what? And I'm like, well, I might think they're wrong about something. He said, but they would be right about everything. I said, well, the Bible doesn't have the details of politics and policy. Yeah, they'd be right about things probably like life, the beginning and the end. And that would be good and important. And I'm not saying that might not be enough. I personally don't want to vote for people who are not pro-life, either at the beginning of it or, the Lord help our brothers and sisters in Canada with those euthanasia laws. And then the laws about, confused laws about marriage and who can marry, confused laws about gender. God made them male and female. That's a witness that we should have to the whole world. We ought to have that witness to the whole world. But a Christian political party, the point is you could actually have, if you go that process, and I'm not suggesting that we do, but you could have different Christian political parties. Because some Christians think that government should be smaller and some think it should be a bit bigger. And of course, a lot of people were like, don't Christians all think the precise things about everything politics? You need to get out more. Or maybe you're just judging people that differ from you who call themselves Christian, but they have some different politics. The immigration, they have some different views about immigration or taxes or guns. I've had people tell me, that the Bible, I said, I think you're getting confused. The Bible has the second commandment. It doesn't say anything about the Second Amendment. And they were like, what? I think they were more concerned about the Second Amendment than the commandment. I actually said that in Michigan at a church once. I got some looks. But seriously, people just assume, well, if I'm a Christian and this is my political thing, it's going to be yours too. Wow, you really do need to get out more. That's just not, it's remarkably arrogant. It's an innocent arrogance, if you can have that. You don't mean to be, but it is. And people in other countries find very strange what American Christians think is obvious Christianity. And we have some people from other countries sitting in this room who probably, I can't even see them all. They're probably smiling and saying amen quietly, hoping there are no ICE agents in the room. No, but yeah, don't get me started. Well, here we see the cosmic lordship of Christ over all. And it's okay that we have political differences. We see the cosmic lordship of Christ over all in Kuyper. That's what he's about. It's a different take, though. This cosmic lordship is a different take than the mediatorial lordship of our friends, the Covenanters, those who are in the RPCNA. And so the whole history and tradition of covenanting began really in Scotland. You had James I, he's James VI of Scotland. He became James I in England, and so he was monarch of both from 1603 to 25. And there were problems with him. The Scots had problems with him, but then they really had problems with his son, Charles I, and the guy he appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop William Laud, and particularly because he tried to impose episcopacy. The Scots were really opposed to episcopacy. I agree with them. Arminianism, I agree with them. And Erastianism, the king being the head of the church. I agree with them on all those things. And in that cocktail, in that mixture that was going on in Scotland, particularly then in the 1620s and 30s, something developed. William Henderson and others developed this whole movement that was called national covenanting. And in 1638, they had the National Covenant. And ultimately, in 1643, you had the Solemn League in Covenant with the English Presbyterians. And that was part of the Westminster Assembly. I can tell you that the English Puritans weren't that crazy about it. There's good evidence that they went along with it just so they could, have some cooperation with the Scots, and the Scots were pretty sharp theologically. But so you have this whole history, and what's going to develop, you're going to have the covenanting movement that will ultimately sort of be expelled from the broader church and will become a very small movement. In this country, the Covenanters are the people, the RPCNA, the Reformed Presbyterians. They're a fairly small group. Some wonderful people in it. I love those people. We differ. They differ with me. You may know them for what are not as important issues theologically, I don't think. The covenant thing is a big thing. You may know them for being exclusive psalm singers but that's not really as big of a thing. I know it is bigger in the actual life of people. So I get it, And I've given some of my Covenanter friends, I said, hey, here's a Trinity Psalter hymnal that I did. And they took it and ripped the hymns out. But no, not really. Not really. But the Covenanters have this view. They've developed it post the Westminster Confession in their testimonies, as they're called, which are these ancillary documents. You can look up, say, the testimony of 1871 in America. That's one of their very famous testimonies. And the thing is, there's a lot of good things in these testimonies, but they have this conviction that not only may a nation, but a nation must. The Christians in a nation must come together and covenant on behalf of the nation. In the sense the nation covenants with God. They go to certain kings. You can go to Josiah. You can go to some different people in the Old Testament who are kind of renewing the covenant and saying to God, you have revealed yourself. You are our God and we are your people. We own that and we come in that name. And so what they're saying is, the Scots should do that. Every nation should do that as a nation. There's simply no warrant for it biblically. There's no warrant in the New Testament for that in any sense of the word. There's no warrant in the Old Testament because it's God making a covenant with Israel. You can't then completely make a covenant with God that He never made with you. God is always the initiator and the inaugurator of every covenant. Nothing else is ever known biblically that way. Never. And so our good covenanter friends do this. Now, I will say this. One of their strengths is they've always understood certain things. They've always been opposed to slavery. They saw it earlier than other people did. They saw it, I think, with a lot of clarity. And they say in their covenant in 1871 where they come together and they're confessing all these sins. And you can hear how they're saying, what they're saying. Let's see here. They're saying, we humble ourselves in the sight of the just and holy one. They've been going on for some paragraphs. In view of the many and great iniquities of the land in which we live, the nation refuses to own its responsibility to God and to the mediator, to recognize the supremacy of the Bible in national affairs, to countenance and encourage the true Christian religion. Atheists, infidels, and all classes of vile men are made constitutionally eligible to the most responsible positions in the government. In other words, non-Christians can be in office. They object to all this. But notice this, consonant with these essential effects, the history of the government has been largely one, and they were saying this all along, one of oppression and injustice towards its aboriginal and colored people. This is being said way back, and they'd been saying it since the very beginning, that when they came over here in the 18th century, the 17th century. Aboriginal, that's older, you spoke of them as the Indians, I suppose, the American Indians. And the colored people were the slave class largely. And of iniquitous distinction of class. That is a great phrase because America still loves to lie to itself. It does it throughout all classes and say it has no classes. America does not believe it has classes. Jefferson said all men are created equal. We don't have classes. England knows they have classes. How could you have an aristocracy? You can't deny it, right? But we have classes. One of the problems with this, if I can just say this, is it keeps us from understanding things sometimes because we did treat the Africans so badly. We've dumped everything into the racial category. And we think race is the mistreatment always. Somebody living in Appalachia, where J.D. Vance came from, if you read his Hillbilly Elegy. I read it years ago when it first came out. Very interesting. Where he came from, the white people he came from, they didn't know white privilege there. Now, there is such a thing in many other places as that. That's true. There is that kind of a thing historically. But in Appalachia, there was white privilege. Why? Because they were lower class. There is class. There's not just race. And that has confused our understanding. Yes, race, that's one of our problems, but not the way we've come to think of it when we deny that there's class distinctions. But anyhow, these folks got it. So they were pretty sharp about some of the problems. But this notion of covenanting, love these folks, but there's just not really a basis for it, I'm afraid. And if you look at something like Westminster Confession 8, some think that suggests this. The earlier Rutherford in Lex Rex sort of seems to suggest this, though George Gillespie certainly denies it. It's highly debated. But in Westminster 8, it says, it pleased God in His eternal purpose to choose and ordain the Lord Jesus, His only begotten Son, to be the mediator between God and man, the prophet, priest, and king, the head and Savior of His church, the heir of all things and judge of the world, unto whom He did from all eternity give a people to be His seed and to be by Him in time redeemed, called, sanctified, and glorified. And of course, it's talking about especially He's the head of this people who are redeemed, called, justified, sanctified, and glorified. So it's suggesting here what the Covenanters are wanting to say too. And William Symington in his famous book, Messiah the Prince, is saying that Christ is mediatorial king of the whole world. The Westminster seems to be saying he's mediatorial. I can say that word. He's the mediatorial king of his people. And in a general way, he's providentially. I want you to notice how 23 puts it, where it's actually talking about the civil magistrate. And the language that's used here is fascinating. So it's talking about, in 23, the civil magistrate. In chapter 1, it says, God, the supreme Lord and King of the world. Notice how it's put here. God, the supreme Lord and King of all the world. It doesn't say Christ in his mediatorial aspect. George Gillespie was very clear. Samuel Rutherford was a Scotsman, and he tended to lean in the direction of the mediatorial, at least he did at an earlier point, the mediatorial kingship of Christ. But then he leaned away from that, maybe towards the end. And certainly his younger colleague, Gillespie, did lean away from it. And if you read Fesco's good book on the theology of the Westminster Standards, John Fesco has a good book on this. And he treats in some depth about the fact that at the assembly, and looking at Chad Van Dixhoorn's minutes and everything, that at the assembly, Gillespie, they first had Christ, the supreme Lord and King of the world. And he said, I think we should put God there. Christ is particularly the mediatorial head of his people. He's the king of his people in a particular and special way. And that's what you heard, I think, back in 8:1. But God, the supreme Lord and King of all the world, he argued it's Father, Son, and Spirit. It's God in his triunity who's really head of all creation. Why am I belaboring this? Last time I was talking about the cosmic lordship of Christ. So basically, Kuyper is saying something very similar to this. He's talking about, Kuyper was talking about cosmic lordship. He wasn't saying that Christ was the mediatorial king of all of creation. He's the mediatorial king of his people. But he is head over all creation, just in the way here, God, the supreme Lord and King of all the world. That's the cosmic lordship of, you can say of Christ, yes, of God, of Christ, of all the persons. And it goes on to talk about that he has ordained civil magistrates to be under him over the people for his own glory, the public good. To this end he hath armed them with the power of the sword for the defense and encouragement of them that are good and for the punishment of evil doers. So there's a lot we could talk about here. I'm just scratching the surface when I'm talking about this. As I say, this is highly debated. Christ is clearly the only head and king of the church in his mediatorial lordship. But the Westminster the Westminster that I've read you doesn't contain the kind of teased out doctrine of the mediatorial headship of Christ that we find in the Covenanters, particularly later in those testimonies that I've been mentioning, and in theologians like William Simonton, whose Messiah, the Prince, the mediatorial dominion of Jesus Christ is key here. And in the American context, as Kevin DeYoung and others point out, this is further clarified. And Kevin has been in a bit of a debate with James Baird, who wrote King of Kings. And I would urge you, if you're reading King of Kings or have read King of Kings, to go read Kevin's review. But Kevin has coming out, and I say this for your encouragement, the Reformed seminary sort of all working all together, the system. It's a huge system of seminaries. They're huge. They're publishing a volume. I'm not sure when it's going to be out, but I've seen it in manuscript because I was asked to make a comment for it. And so that's sort of become a cottage industry in my life these days, making comments. So if you have a book, just give it to me. I'll make a comment. Yeah, it looks good. Yeah. But Kevin DeYoung has and Kevin is sort of a real ally for me in all of this. Kevin was just the moderator of the PCA General Assembly, so there you go. And he's a South Holland boy. But I think, Ed, are you a White Sox fan? I love you anyway. No, so is Kevin. So I got to really, I addressed the General Assembly on behalf of GCP. So Kevin was in the chair. They asked, the GCP, because I'm the president of the board, asked me to address the PCA General Assembly. So it was great, Kevin. So I got to say South Holland, and I made a little White Sox thing. And I said, they love the PCA at, I don't know about the Sox, but at Wrigley, I mean, I was just there, and they were chanting PCA, PCA. It was amazing. I said, now it could be Pete Crow Armstrong, but I don't know. I think it was no. So because a couple guys were out there, and then they were like, who? Crow? What? No. At any rate, so but when you get that book. So when Reformed Seminary publishes this book, and different scholar has written on each of the chapters of the Westminster Confession. So it'll be a treat. So my good friend John Meether writes on some, Fesco writes on some, Scott Swain, all kind of people write on them. Kevin writes on chapter 23, which is the chapter on the civil magistrate. It's an excellent article. And James Baird, here's what James Baird is saying, is what was changed in the American context, and we don't have time right now to really go through all that. You can go look. All this stuff is so easy to get. In other words, if you want to know what if you have the Trinity Psalter hymnal, that's what the American churches believe. That's what the OPC believes. That's what the PCA believes. Chapter 23. It's right there, easily accessed. But what was in the old version, the old original version, was similar to what in our last session Kuyper was talking against the Belgic about. Kuyper said, I don't like this Constantinianism. Well, in America, starting in 1729 in the adopting, and then 1789, we changed it and we took the Constantinianism out. That is to say, we said that we didn't want the civil magistrate punishing heretics, defining what the true religion should be. We did not seek any of that because that wasn't biblical. There was no warrant for it. It hadn't worked. It was always turned back on us, often turned back on us. And the history bears this out. There's just no good history of this working well. And even like I said, I think the experiment in Holland for 200 years, if you'd really have to pay a lot of attention to that. And if the church wasn't allowed to meet as a synod and deal with heresy because the state was like, it's not that bad. See, that the state never takes theology as seriously as the church does. It'll look at things the church is saying, this is a real problem. When the magistrate has that power and he's like, that's not really a problem. That's not really a problem. It's like, just like even some of our churches can be like, you have to, if it's adultery, well, we know that's wrong, so we're going to go at you for that. But you can have some bad error and, we'll leave you alone. You're a nice guy, So Kevin talks about how, I have the article. It's not been published yet, but it will be. And he basically sets forth the differences between original Westminster, which has an established church, and has not just an established church, that's another point we can argue about, but it has the magistrate over it. And this is what he ends the whole thing with. I'll just tell you a little bit about 23:3. The civil magistrate hath authority. It's his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses and worship and discipline prevented or reformed, and all the ordinances of God duly settled, administered, and observed. This is all coming under the civil magistrate. He can call synods, be present at them. He can provide that whatever is transacted in them is according to the mind and word of God. He's going to tell the church that. Who is that going to be? Do you want me to start naming political figures? And do you want them telling the church what the doctrine is? If you do, I do have some friends who are therapists. I can give you their card. But, sorry. He ends with this. Kevin ends with this. He says, the American Presbyterians did not believe what the Westminster Divines believed about the civil magistrate. They rejected an older European model, and that's what Kuyper was rejecting, whereby the magistrate ensured that only the right religion, his religion, was practiced in the land. If American Presbyterians in particular want to look to their confessional past for a model of church-state relations, they will have to determine if they're going back to London or back to Philadelphia. In other words, are they going back to original Westminster, or are they going to stick with what we've said here? They cannot be in both places at the same time. You either believe that original or you believe how we've changed it.